Good evening. We're going to try it again. Good evening. That's better. Welcome to the Shoals Marine Laboratories weekly science seminar. I'm Sarah Morris, the John M. Kingsbury Executive Director of the Shoals Marine Lab, and I'm thrilled to have everyone who is here with us this evening, both on Appledore and online. For anyone who is new to the lab, the Shoals Marine Lab is the largest and oldest marine lab dedicated to undergraduate training, both in terms of coursework and in terms of research. And we are co-sponsored by the University of New Hampshire and Cornell University. Our seminars are affectionately called Rock Talks because in the early days, they literally occurred on the rocks. And especially on a night like tonight, when we just had that downpour, we're really happy to not be on the rocks and instead to be inside. This is an opportunity for the entire island to come together and to meet with, and to also invite many of our guests from to join us online to hear more about different aspects of ecology, the environment, the marine biology, and the organisms that we've been studying. We're excited to have everyone here in person and online for this seminar. The format for the seminar will be a 45-minute talk followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. For our friends online, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For our friends in the that are here in the Commons, please raise your hand. I will be bringing the microphone around. It's important that you talk directly into the microphone so that the people online can hear the question and then hear the answer. That's really important for them. This evening's speaker is Dr. Ebett Siddon, whose work is focused in the Eastern Bering Sea at the intersection of science and management, providing real-time information on ecosystem status and potential impacts to Alaskan fisheries. Ebett is a research fisheries biologist at NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Juneau, Alaska. She received her BS in marine and freshwater biology from the University of New Hampshire and her master's and PhD in fisheries from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. She was a National Research Council postdoctoral fellow studying across ecosystem comparison of predator-prey dynamics with implications for predicting ecosystem-level responses to climate variability. She received the NOAA Gold Medal Award for the Bering Sea Project for leading and conducting a comprehensive integrated ecosystem research program that reveals how climate cycles affect the nation's largest fishery. She also received a Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers for exemplary achievement in linking climate-mediated shifts in fisheries recruitment dynamics to ecosystem functioning, and for the development of ecosystem-based metrics used in forecasting fisheries' response to climate variability. Ebett has a very long history with the Shoals Marine Lab. She's going to tell you a little bit more, but I do have to share that she's been teaching classes for us here since 2005. Initially, she taught underwater research, and more recently, she has been in the among the teachers for the Marine Ecosystem Research and Management. As soon as I realized this, I missed an entire paragraph of the introduction. So I'll come back to that in just a second. She also served as the Shoals Island Coordinator in 2000 and our Dive Master in 2001. For our friends online, we have a number of people here in the Commons. We have 4 classes, so we are very full. We have Marine Ecosystem Research and Management. We have Integrative Marine Biology Laboratory. I'm going to do the small one. We have Underwater Research. And now I'm forgetting which one it is because I didn't look at my notes. EME. Oh, thank you, EME, Ecology and the Marine Environment. In addition, we have our 10-week summer interns that are affectionately known as SURGES, our Shoals Undergraduate Research Group. So for me, it's particularly exciting to have Ebett here, who has been on the faculty of 2 of the 4 classes that we are teaching on the island right now, and who has connections to all of the classes in terms of the topics that she's covering. So this evening, she will be presenting how Alaska's fisheries science and management are keeping pace with changing conditions, in which she will explore how Alaska utilizes ecosystem-based fisheries management to consider changing environmental and socioeconomic conditions when managing federal fisheries using several case studies. Please join me in welcoming our very own Ebett Siddon.
was quite an introduction that I hope I can live up to. Thank you, Sarah. I'm just going to jump in because I couldn't pick which things I wanted to tell you about, so I'm going to try to get through them all. Here's the outline. I'll do a brief background, but Sarah covered a lot of it. I'll introduce Alaska's large marine ecosystems, so we're all familiar with where I'm talking about. And then I'll introduce what Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management is, which ought to be familiar to the MERM students from this afternoon. And then I'll go through some recent management challenges. I'm not sure we'll get to the upcoming Super El Niño, but we'll see how I do on time. Okay, so as Sarah said, this is like the last 30 years. I started at the Shoals Lab in underwater research in 1997. It was the reason I decided to go to the University of New Hampshire. And I put this up here to say everything that has happened since then is because of starting at Shoals. Like I can sort of connect the line back to everything I've been able to do since then, back to the Shoals Marine Lab. So it's an incredible opportunity. And I hope, you all sitting here tonight take advantage of the opportunity you have to be here and to meet the people that you're able to meet while you're here. I did graduate from the University of New Hampshire in 2000, and then I worked out here in 2000 and 2001. Then we moved to Alaska. I did a master's in subtitle kelp ecology. And then that same year also started teaching the underwater research class. I taught that from 2005 to 2018. In that same window, I also finished my PhD that Sarah mentioned in Bering Sea, fisheries oceanography, early life history of fishes. And then in 2016, started my current position now with NOAA at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Juneau. And then in 2019, transitioned to really more of what I do now with Mike and Kristen, who will be out here later this week, really connecting science to management. And that's what I hope you'll get out of the examples I give tonight, is thinking about the research side of things, but how do we use that in management decisions? Okay, so Shoals is like all over in my history. Again, it's just really been a part of everything I've done and gotten to do. Okay, let's go to Alaska. Here are Alaska's 4 what we call large marine ecosystems: Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, Eastern Bering Sea, and the Arctic. If we look at it from a sort of current map perspective, and if we started in Southeast Alaska in the Eastern Gulf and dropped that rubber ducky in the currents, it would take about 1.5 to 2 years for that ducky to get to the Western Gulf of Alaska. There are then some major passes through the Aleutian chain up into the Bering Sea. That rubber ducky up through the Bering Strait up into the Arctic would take another about 12 to 14 months. So there are slow, sluggish currents throughout Alaska. It's also a very large place. And so the scale of things sometimes is hard to relate to when you're from small states like New England, and I'm from New Hampshire, so I can say that. Okay, I want to give a little bit of background on the Gulf of Alaska and the Eastern Bering Sea, because I'll give 1 example from the Gulf of Alaska and 2 from the Bering Sea. So the Gulf of Alaska, it's about 2,000 kilometers from east to west. It has a very narrow shelf habitat. You can see the lighter is up on the continental shelf habitat where most of the fisheries would occur. We already talked about that counterclockwise flow. There's a lot of sort of diversity in the terrain around the Gulf of Alaska. So there's a lot of eddies and interesting habitats, which is quite different from the Bering Sea. The state waters go 0 to 3 miles, and the main state fisheries in the Gulf are all 5 of your salmon species. In the federal waters, from 3 to 200 nautical miles, pollock, Pacific cod, sablefish, and Pacific Ocean perch are the main federal fisheries. No line in the sand, of course, at 3 miles. So there's a lot of collaboration between the state and federal managers for fisheries across Alaska. Moving to the Eastern Bering Sea, this is a huge ecosystem, 1,200 kilometers. The shelf is here 500 kilometers wide. It's a lot shallower than people think. Average depth, it's only 70 meters. And it's a really productive system because you have a lot of upwelling coming from the deep basin onto the shelf. It is otherwise, I think of as like a pretty boring mud flat. The habitat's pretty consistent, soft seafloor for much of the Bering Sea shelf. The state waters here are 3 of the salmon species, chum, Chinook, and sockeye. And then the federal fisheries dominated by pollock, Pacific cod, yellowfin sole, and snow and tanner crab are co-managed with the state. So those are the main fisheries for the Eastern Bering Sea. Okay. The background, sort of management backdrop for the work that we do, NOAA's mission, if you're not familiar here, we have jurisdiction and responsibility for all of the ocean resources and their habitats within 300 to 200 miles. And we do that backed by sound science and an ecosystem-based approach to management. We're also governed by several different laws and frameworks, the main of which is the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management and Conservation Act. That is what created the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ, out to 200 miles. It also created 8 regional fishery management councils. Those council bodies are who make management decisions. NOAA provides the science, and those councils are the ones who have to actually make the decisions. So this is a map of the 8 regional management councils around the country. So the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council is who we present to for Alaska, and then the other 7 regions around the US. It is still the Gulf of Mexico Management Council, now jurisdiction over the Gulf of America. Then there are national standards. There's 10 national standards that govern also the science that we do and provide. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll highlight a few. The first is National Standard 1, optimum yield. It's a good reminder. Does anyone know what department NOAA Fisheries sits in the government? Department of Commerce. So it is an economically driven agency while preventing overfishing and having sustainable stocks, but we are trying to achieve optimum yield. We also often cite National Standard 2, this providing the best scientific information available. And then I'll skip down to some of the examples I'll talk about. National Standard 8 is to keep the importance of resources to communities in mind. And then 9 to minimize bycatch and mortality of bycatch. So those will come up later. The last sort of layer of laws and orders are any relevant executive orders that may come up as administrations change. So the recent one for us that came out in April of 2025, this Restoring American Seafood Competitiveness, has several key objectives: reducing regulatory burdens, America First seafood strategy to address international seafood impacts to our markets. And the last one, review of marine monuments, has been in the news lately, considering opening previously closed areas to commercial fishing, has been in the news for the Pacific Islands specifically. There's some key quotes in here that I think are important to still highlight, though. This is still within the requirements of those overarching laws. So executive orders don't supersede anything in the Magnuson-Stevens Act, Endangered Species Act, and the Animal Protection Act. And then the bottom quote is just, I think, a reminder, not a difference from what we were doing, focusing that fisheries management and research on our core stocks that support seafood and fisheries. Okay, so the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council is who manages our federal fisheries. So that's who we present our science to. They meet 4 times every year. Every meeting is 7 to 10 days, including the weekends. It used to be 5 until they decided that was too many. And what's one thing that's unique about the North Pacific Council is we set fisheries quotas annually. It's not true of all the regional 8 regions, but we take a look at crab and groundfish stocks annually. And that's important. We talked today in class. It gives us an opportunity every year annually to also pair stock assessments with ecosystem information so they can use that when setting quotas. So we have over 140 species total between crab and groundfish that we look at each year. And then again, just a reminder, NOAA, we are not the decision makers. We are providing the science to the council. It is the council's job to then balance competing interests when they make their decisions for quotas. So just some ideas of things, utilizers of the resource include birds or other fish that need food in the system, recreational fisheries, commercial fisheries. And for Alaska, I'll have an example of the importance of subsistence and traditional uses of resources. So It is the council's job to weigh all of those needs when they're making decisions. Okay, and this is just a slide to say I refer to it as our toolbox. There's a lot of different ways in which we do ecosystem-based management through consideration of the ecosystem status reports like I produce. We have ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles. We have ecosystem models and management strategy evaluations, optimum yield caps, and a variety of different time and area closures. All of those things can be counted as ecosystem-based management, and collectively we utilize those tools every year when they're setting quotas. Okay, this is good. I want to get to the examples. So I'm going to start with, in the Gulf of Alaska, Pacific cod. This was probably the first example where, for Alaska anyway, we had a real fishery collapse. So this is really a story about the blob. Who's familiar or has heard of the blob? Marine heat wave in the Pacific. It occurred from 2014 to 2016. And there have been other heat waves. Heat waves are not uncommon anymore. What was unique about the blob is that that heat was at the surface. It's just a graphic showing sea surface temperature, but it was also at depth. This is data from a subsurface mooring showing the depth extended all the way through the water column. And then the last sort of trifecta of this is that it continued through 2 winters and 3 summers. We termed it like the endless summer. These fish had nowhere to go to find cooler water and had no reprieve for a long period of time in the water. It's easy to look, this example, I'll start with easy to look back now, sort of hindsight 2020. We can piece together what happened to Pacific cod. When we look, there were clear signs from the lower trophic level that the base of the food web was hit pretty hard by the blob. We had declines in large lipid-rich copepods. We had declines in euthausids or krill. Both of those are really important food sources to a lot of things in the pelagic environment. And then low forage fish abundance and quality, all signs at the time that there was something happening in the lower base of the food web. Also signs at the top of the food web. There was a massive seabird die-off of common murres, 4 million murres, about estimated half of the region population died in a single winter. I don't know if folks will have access. These are all hot links to the article later if folks are interested. And then there was also an unusual mortality event declared for large whales. Large whales were dying and stranding in 2015 in the middle of this heat wave event. So we had bottom-up indicators. We had top of the food web indicators. And in the middle there, we had the biomass of Pacific cod. This is thousands of metric tons on the y-axis over time. And the heat wave years 2014 to 2016, the Pacific cod population declined about 83%. So again, hindsight 2020, what happened? We had these warm waters right at the surface, at the bottom, and persisting through time. That led to increased metabolic demands for the fish. Cod are relatively fast growing and short lived, so they need to get a lot of food to grow. And with those increased metabolic demands, that was paired with this poor prey quality and quantity. So they were not able to find enough food. We had evidence from our surveys showing that the fish condition, the measure of their sort of fat size standardized above the axis would be good condition, or fatter below the 0 is poor condition or skinnier. So you can see in 2016, the fish were suddenly much skinnier, not getting enough food, and that led to these high levels of mortality in the population. This is all sort of on the science side. We can look back now and piece these bits together. On the management side, it's sort of fascinating to learn what played out in real time. So when that survey came back and the stock assessment author went to run his model for the upcoming, every year they're going to the council, that model didn't fit. It couldn't fit such a low number in such a short amount of time. The only way he could make that model fit was to change the natural mortality parameter in his model. But when he did that, he also walked down the hall to the ecosystem group and said, what could have caused this? I'm going to say it's an increase in natural mortality to make my numbers work, but why might that have happened? And they were able to collaborate to say there was no food, the water was warm, the increased metabolic demand. So what happened then was the stock assessment author, when they went to the council, they brought the lead for the ecosystem report in the Gulf of Alaska with them to the table. They presented together to the scientific and statistical committee. That's the first body, the review body of our council. And that change in the natural mortality parameter and the adjustment was, here's the quote, accepted because of the strong rationale that was presented by both the stock assessment author and the ecosystem group for those increased mortalities in 2015 and 16. As that adjustment and recommendation moved forward to the council themselves, the council was faced with this decision to reduce the quota for the following year in 2018 by 80%. This is probably the second biggest commercial fishery in the Gulf of Alaska. An 80% reduction is huge economically for fishermen, for communities around the Gulf of Alaska. And what was sort of still stunning to me now looking back, it was not an outrage. People, my coworker, the ecosystem lead who presented, she'll say now, when ecosystem-based management works, it's quiet. There wasn't a lot of, I mean, people were not happy about an 80% reduction, but this quote from the council member, there was a reason, this rationale that was presented, and people understood. The fishermen in the room who fish in the Gulf of Alaska or out of Kodiak said, yeah, those fish were skinny. So what they were seeing on the water was matching what the scientists were saying. And so they sort of understood and accepted that decision. So what did we learn from that again, hindsight 2020, communication, collaboration, and transparency, the stock assessment author, the ecosystem group, going as soon as that stock assessment author, saw that in his model, going to the council and saying, this is what we think is happening, helped build that trust with all the stakeholders. The second thing, did we learn we can predict species responses to future heat wave events? The blob was 2014 to 16. So we know how cod are going to react. There was another heat wave in 2018. What do we tell the managers? Do we tell them to be cautious about cod? Okay, here's where I want you to pay attention. I'm going to say no, because the cod already died in 2014 to 16. They can't die again in 2018. Neither can the MERS. The populations hadn't recovered enough. You can see in the bottom graph here, 2 years later, to have another crash in cod. What I'm going to try to convince you of is that the best we can do is that we should expect an ecosystem response comparable to the scale of the impact. We will see a stock respond. It will just vary depending on the context. So wherever your ecosystem is when an event hits will help determine the outcome and the response of the ecosystem to that event. If you don't have any cod to crash, something else might. It was capelin in 2018. Other things respond. Okay. Now we're going to change gears and go to the Bering Sea and talk about snow crab. Has anyone heard about the snow crab collapse in the Bering Sea? One. Good. This will be new. All right. This plot is showing air temperature anomalies at St. Paul Island. St. Paul Island is one of the two Pribilof Islands in the middle of the Bering Sea. And we have actually a 100-year time series of air temperatures from St. Paul Island. And this is just to show, again, it's an anomaly. So red bars above the line are warmer than average. Blue bars below the line are cooler conditions. So you can see the Bering Sea has had warm and cold conditions over the past several decades. Until 2014, the Bering Sea entered one of the longest in duration and highest in magnitude warm phases in the time series. On top of it being this prolonged warm phase in the Bering Sea, we also had these pulse events in 2018 and 19 where we had no sea ice. In the Bering Sea, we have seasonal sea ice that comes down in the winter and retreats in the summer. And the extent of that sea ice can vary from year to year. In 2018 and 19, there was no sea ice in the Bering Sea. So this is just a graphic from a article in the Seattle Times that covered this unprecedented event in 18 and 19. So on the left is a typical ice year in 2013. So the white outline would be sea ice coming down. It tends to reach its max extent around March. And then if you compare that to 2018, no sea ice came down over the Bering Sea. It was termed unprecedented at the time. In 2019, the same thing happened again. The radio ad saying unprecedented again in 2019. And that matters almost much of the Bering Sea ecosystem is driven by the presence of sea ice. And that is because winter sea ice forms a summer bottom cold pool over the shelf. And that cold pool determines where things want to be spatially. So in the preceding winter, that ice forms. As it melts and cold, dense water sinks to the bottom the following summer, that where that cold pool is over the shelf, some things like to be in the colder water, other things don't like to be in the colder water and will avoid it by being further out on the shelf. So with that lack of sea ice in 2018 and 19, lack of a cold pool, species had the opportunity to shift northward over the shelf. And that is exactly what we saw. This is a map of Pacific cod in the Bering Sea now. On the left, I'm showing a typical distribution in a sort of cooler or average year in 2010. The pink outline is that cold pool. It's the footprint of where ice was the winter before. And the background heat map color with the purple is the biomass of Pacific cod from our survey. So you can see the Pacific cod don't want to be in the cold pool. They're all around the edges of it and really held over the southern part of the Bering Sea. Contrast that on the right-hand side in 2018, no cold pool. The Pacific cod had the opportunity to shift northward, and more than 50% of the population was found in the northern Bering Sea in 2018. There were also indications throughout the ecosystem of a response to 2018 and 19, this lack of sea ice and lack of cold pool, very similar to the Gulf of Alaska. We had, in this case, a short-tailed shearwater die-off event and an unusual mortality event due to gray whale mortality. Both of these species, short-tailed shearwaters and gray whales, feed in the northern Bering Sea in the summer before they both embark on long migrations to their mating or feeding grounds for the summer. And so there was concern, both of these sort of red flags, that there's a concern about the carrying capacity in the northern Bering Sea. Suddenly, cod, other fish species able to go north where they don't usually go, and then maybe upsetting the balance for the ecosystem for other species that rely on that area for feeding. Then we had snow crab. Snow crab really rely on sea ice, both for temperature, but also likely related to ice-associated algae and the production in the ecosystem. And so in 2018 and 19, we saw, similar to Gulf Pacific cod, a collapse of about 10 billion snow crab over a very short period of time. Similar story, again, looking back in hindsight, what happened, we could pull together work that was done at our Kodiak lab studies on snow crab, understanding from similar metabolic demand understanding from our fish side. Warm waters, increased metabolic demand, same issue for crab, lack of a cold pool and the decreased spatial extent for snow crab habitat was a factor. And that led to poor body condition. Again, the hypothesis that they were starving in the system and a high mortality event during those 2 years of no sea ice. Again, on the management side, the stock assessment author, similar to Pacific cod, had to make adjustments to his model to even get the model to fit, to capture and account for such a dramatic decline in the population. The council at the time reduced the quota 88% in a single year from 2020 to 2021. And that wasn't enough for the population. The stock was actually closed in 22 through 24 and declared overfished. So different than the Gulf of Alaska. Here we have a fishery closure and impacts now to the socioeconomics of an estimated 500 million because of the closure in the fishery. And that's because there's both job losses in harvesting and processing sectors and revenues for the communities and businesses associated with fisheries related to the snow crab fishery. So slightly different story for snow crab, and bringing in this idea from the fishermen. And here's where I get to the part of the talk where I don't have the answers anymore. Still communication, collaboration, transparency, that was all important. It's good that our management system, we have a lot of trust between the scientists, the managers, and the fishers. Again, such a dramatic event. We expected some sort of response from the ecosystem. It happened to be snow crab in this case. But now these community impacts and the question asked of, you know, if we know they're going to die, this is what the fishermen are asking now. Why can't we catch them? And that's what, those are the questions the fishery managers have to struggle with on the, you know, they're the ones balancing these interests. And this is the pressure, the kind of question they get from stakeholders. Okay, and I'll go to the last story, which is sort of ongoing current. I don't have 2020 for this one, and I certainly don't have the answers, but it is probably the biggest fishery science management and political issue affecting fisheries in Alaska right now. So I couldn't not bring it to you. This is looking at Western Alaska salmon and pollock, again, in the Bering Sea. So first, I'll just sort of go through this issue by the numbers. So if we look at the pollock fishery, it is the largest fishery in the US. It has a $2 billion total economic value and supports about 30,000 jobs. The annual quota for pollock in the Bering Sea is about 1.3 million metric tons. So there's more than that pollock in the Bering. That is the removal every year based on the quota. Salmon bycatch does occur in the pollock fishery. It is largely Chinook salmon and chum salmon, and that the science based on genetics estimates that about 2% of Chinook and 1% of chum salmon that would otherwise return to Western Alaska rivers are caught as bycatch. So on a percentage basis, a rather small number. For the community impacts, for communities that live along the rivers in Western Alaska, along the Yukon River and the Kuskokwim River, I can sort of emphasize enough how important salmon are to these communities. So, and they have seen dramatic declines, similar kinds of declines as Pacific cod and snow crab, declines in the runs that are returning to these Western Alaska salmon rivers, to the point where they are now closed to subsistence on the rivers. So the community members cannot harvest salmon on the rivers for subsistence. Now I will give you those same bycatch numbers as actual numbers. Chinook average every year about 8,777 based on genetics and modeling. And for chum salmon, 47,000 salmon are caught as bycatch in the pollock fishery while local subsistence is closed. That's the heart of the issue. The management, the North Pacific Council, is then faced with, they're the ones with the levers. What can we do about bycatch, or, you know, what levers do we have to try to restore salmon populations in Western Alaska? So they can think about things like bycatch caps. You can put a cap on the number of Chinook or the number of chum that can be caught. After that, we close the fishery. Or they can think about more dynamic management structures like rolling hotspots, time and area closures to protect runs at certain times. Now, if I give you this story from if you put yourselves for a minute in each of these stakeholder groups, you'll start to see how hard this is going to be to sort out. So if you're working in the pollock industry, your argument is you are providing food for the world. This is a giant source of protein that is being used for product all over the world. It's in fillets, it's in fillets, there's a roe fishery, there's, every part of the pollock is used and sold in different markets around the world. And there would be, if we were to close the pollock fishery, economic losses to Alaskan communities, including some of these communities along the rivers, because we have community development quotas or CDQ programs where revenue from the fishery goes to the communities. Now I'm gonna put scientists in there as a stakeholder group for a minute. Again, remember our mission, we're bound by conducting sound science backed by ecosystem-based approaches. We have all of the genetic work for every bycaught salmon is sampled. We have the genetics for it. We know what river it would have returned to. It's how we can estimate what proportion of the population would have returned. Those modeling results and the projections of the populations for these Western Alaska stocks say that even if we eliminate bycatch, we will not restore these salmon populations. It's just too small of an impact for the overall population. Other things are driving the decline in these salmon populations. The other thing that doesn't come up in conversation very often, but my colleague and I are trying to raise awareness of, the reason that salmon are bycaught with pollock is because they're utilizing the same habitat. They're in the ocean together because they're eating the same thing. So if you were to say, shut down the pollock fishery to stop bycatch, that's a solution. You will be leaving 1 million metric tons of pollock in the water that eat the same thing as your salmon. So that increased prey competition between pollock and salmon also might not be the answer. Now, if we go to communities, again, I cannot underestimate the importance of salmon to Western Alaska and indigenous communities cannot be understated. It is not just about food security, although I put that here. It is ingrained in in all of their traditional ways of life, in all of their sort of generational teaching and learning and ways of being. So that piece also so hard to think about how to incorporate that in this decision and what to do moving forward. So then the management, this is where those councils, those bodies are forced with, again, balancing these competing interests. Do you say close down the pollock industry? That would fix bycatch. Or do you try to sort of balance, even though the science says eliminating bycatch won't fix the problem? This is what is happening in Alaska fisheries and now politics. Right now, we have, I think we're up to 17 gubernatorial candidates, including our House candidates. All of them are starting to talk about this issue and opinions on both sides about sort of what to do about it. And I don't have the answer except to say, I sort of keep reminding myself and people that this is still, our mission is still the sound science. We are still providing the science to the decision makers, and we're using it through this ecosystem-based approach. The managers, they're tasked with that really impossible job of balancing the competing interests, and I don't know what they'll decide. And then I'll leave you with this quote we bring up all the time. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong, right? Simply shutting down the pollock industry, though it would solve bycatch, is not going to solve this problem. Yeah, I'm muted. Should we talk about El Niño really quickly? Okay. Have you heard there's a Super El Niño coming? Okay, I just updated. I went online the other day when I was finishing these to figure out the most current updated probability. So 63% chance of a very strong El Niño. That's the really red dark bars coming this fall through the winter. So later this week when it's really hot, that is not the Super El Niño. It's not coming until the fall. And then when and where it hits is not always going to be easy to predict. So the west coast of California is talking a lot about the Super El Niño. For Alaska, we're trying to push back a little bit to say it's not as clear. El Nino is a equatorial Pacific phenomenon. The farther you get from the equatorial Pacific, the less relevant it is in driving our ecosystem. So we, in Alaska, we expect if we see impacts of the El Nino, it will be in the Gulf of Alaska first. It will show up in the Eastern Gulf because those currents are coming up from California. So we have increased monitoring happening in the Eastern Gulf to look for signs of impacts. When you start moving out to the Aleutians have actually largely been in heat wave status since 2014. They did not cool off the way the Bering did at around 2021. And they're not, those warm conditions are not really driven by El Nino events. In the Bering Sea, there's a great graph I didn't put in here, but looking at ice extent and El Nino status, and there's no relationship. So what happens in the Bering Sea is driven more so by a climate pattern called the Aleutian low pressure system that determines whether air is coming, cold air from the Arctic or warm air from the south that drives our dynamics. Okay, that's it. That's all.
We have times for questions, so please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic around.
Thank you so much. It was a brilliant speech. And my question is, in one of the diagrams, you shows because of climate change, a lot of fish populations like the cod are moving northward. And this is by no means rationalizing the existence of climate change, but I'm wondering if they're moving northward, are their population also diminishing from the temperature? And can we utilize those aquatic resources the same way that we used to, just moving up all the equipment and stuff?
So it's a good question. And if you can remember the map, if you're a stock in the Gulf of Alaska, you can't shift north, right? So the ability where you could go to get cooler temperatures, you don't have a lot of places to go in the Gulf of Alaska. In the Bering Sea, you can go north. And I think it's this is one of the points I've tried to present to the council. It would be really easy to just think of the northern Bering Sea then as an extension of the southern Bering Sea and just sort of move everything up. But it's not that simple. The shelf in the northern Bering Sea is much narrower. It's a much smaller habitat, like sort of total square kilometers. So it isn't just as simple as like, oh, we just shift everything up and continue managing them the same. It's a different ecosystem. And the Mike and I have been involved. There was years ago in my PhD research, an integrated ecosystem project studying the southern Bering Sea. And that's how we have a lot of this sort of mechanistic understanding of what happens there. We are just starting this year will be our first field season, a northern Bering Sea integrated ecosystem program to try to better because we know this is what's happening, right? We're going to have fewer and fewer years with extensive ice. Things are going to shift, and what's going to happen. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. So as you were talking about the salmon population, the bycatch being such a little part of why they're suffering, do you have more of a, do we know closer to why the population is so low? Is it dams? Is it like the nutrients? Is it like habitat condition? And why do you think people aren't talking about those reasons as much?
So yes, we have good, there's great understanding of what is driving those populations. It has to do with river temperatures. So really warm river temperatures that affect the egg and fry stage. And then when they out migrate into the ocean, their feeding condition, it's warm. Again, same story, metabolic demands, ability to find enough food. And again, lots of studies on their condition as juveniles and returning adults back to the stream. And I think the reason we aren't talking about it is because there's no lever for those things.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, a lot of the talks about the council and their decisions, and I was wondering who gets to be on the councils. Who is there an elected process? Or
yeah, good question. I was like, I should remind myself. So I think the North Pacific Council has 18 members, voting members, and it's from all the states. So Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, that have skin in the game in Alaskan fisheries. There's seats, like there is a voting member seat from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game because of all the co-management of species. So there's very specific seats on that council and a sort of political elective process to be on the council.
Thank you. I'm just wondering how over time, as the world's population has increased, the amount of fish that are fished has increased. So if populations of fish are stable or declining, how has the amount of fish that we're taking up reflected that?
So, I mean, I don't know about relative to human population globally, but in Alaska, we have optimum yield ranges for the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. And those ranges are set in like congressional law at this point. To change them would take an act of Congress. The cap in the Bering Sea is, in the Gulf of Alaska is, 850,000 metric tons or something in a year. When you add up all the stocks in the Gulf of Alaska, it never quite reaches that maximum cap in the Gulf of Alaska. We're always under that. So we've been under that cap harvesting removals from the Gulf for as long as I know of. In the Bering Sea, it's a different story. The optimum yield band, the cap is at 2 million metric tons, and we are every year up against that 2 million metric ton cap. So adding up the quotas for all the different stocks, it becomes then decision by the council who to allocate quota to get to 2 million. You could remove more than 2 million based on the stock assessments and sustainable yield stock assessment models. You could remove more than that from the Bering Sea, but this act of Congress OY cap at 2 million limits that. So we've in some ways been under harvesting from the Bering Sea.
Are any of these species also subject to like international cooperative management? And if so, like how do the ecosystem data that you all put together to understand it inform or not, like sort of what's going on across the rest of the range?
Yeah, so I just talked about federally managed species that are within the Alaska jurisdiction, but something like Pacific halibut is managed by the International Pacific Halibut Commission. Totally different structure, different body, different science that informs it. Yeah.
Ebett, and your graph of I'm going to take you way back to the Pacific cod. It looked like there had been a bit of a significant decline, and then a bit of a rebound, and then a deeper decline because of the blob. Any idea what allowed for the rebound in that earlier one, and whether that's something that could be recreated or facilitated in some way?
I would have to go back and look, sort of match up the previous trend with the indicators, with temperature, with prey availability, to see if it's, if it's just a temperature link, there was a reprieve in cooler conditions or something. Those are hard things to force to recreate.
My brain keeps going back to the quote that you gave with the snow crabs, with the if they're going to die anyways, why don't we eat them? And I'm just kind of curious what role, in addition to the science that is being presented, what role do some of these stakeholder voices or communities have in the decision-making process?
Yeah, so at every step, the management process, and I'll just describe Alaska. Again, I said it's an annual process. We start in September. Well, we start now. All of our surveys are out now, June, July, August, collecting data. data comes back, stock assessment authors start cranking their models in August, September, and we start presenting to plan teams, crab and groundfish plan teams. That's like a peer review, internal review of all the assessments and the ecosystem reports. That starts in September. There's a council meeting in October when crab quotas are set. There's another plan team in November, and then the final council meeting in December. So there's all these opportunities throughout the fall. At every one of those meetings, they're public, open to the public. They're listed in the Federal Register because they're federal public meetings, and an opportunity for public comment on every item. So you can have public comment on the ecosystem status report. You can have public comment on any particular stock assessment. And I'm really just focusing on stock assessment. The council takes up other management issues. So in the last handful of years, they've been talking about a chum salmon bycatch. That issue comes up at iterative conversations in the council, and every time has public comment. And some of those in the last handful of years, when the council is at a sort of final action decision for some of those salmon bycatch, they will have hundreds of testifiers sign up, and the council will sit. It is days, literally, because every member of the public who wants to testify has, I think an individual has 5 minutes, and if you're representing a corporation or an industry or a tribal group, you have 7 or something like that. And there will be hundreds of people signed up, and you'll just listen for days, literally. Yeah.
Ebett, could you talk a little bit about how the bycatch percentage is calculated? How are they collecting that data? Who collects it? And how is it being collected, reported, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so there are bycatch reports that are produced by the scientists and provided to the council. Well, I won't get all the details right about our monitoring, but commercial fisheries have like 100% monitoring in Alaska. So every bycaught fish is sampled by an onboard observer, and there is genetic work done back at the lab to identify the home origin of those stocks. So it's a combination of the genetics, being able to identify where those fish would have returned to, and also in the link to the Iannelli paper, that calculation also involves estimation of, because sometimes the bycaught fish are juveniles. So not all juveniles are going to make it back to the rivers anyway, just natural mortality. So there's modeled work to estimate, what percentage of those would be returning and wouldn't be subject to other mortality events along the way.
And I wanted you to mention something, 100% of observation. Who's doing the observation? Not the fishermen themselves.
Yeah, NOAA has fisheries observers.
I was talking with some of the students last career panel about unusual positions that could let you use your science and that. So I was hoping you would share that. Are there other questions for you, Ebett?
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering how is it enforced that fisheries are kept to a certain number of how much they can catch, and how do you guys know that they respect that number? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. So again, I talked a lot about the science side. I work at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. There is a management counterpart to every region that is the Alaska Regional Office. Those are the sort of reg writers, and they have a whole in-season management department. So they are in real time tracking catch from all of these. Anybody participating in federal fisheries has to report their catch. And the in-season managers are in real time quantifying, like, how close are you to that cap? They're also monitoring any prohibited species catch or bycatch, because for some species, like in the pollock fishery, they have limits on how many herring they can catch. So the in-season managers are monitoring pollock catch. They're also monitoring herring, prohibited species catch, and that can sometimes shut down the pollock fishery as well. It's called a choke species. If you get too many in bycatch, it can shut down the fishery. So all of that is happening in real time by the in-season managers at the regional office. And the salmon, sorry, the pollock industry is really heavily regulated for a variety of different, I just talked about herring, but chum salmon, there's all these different regulations, time and area, places they can't be. So it is in their benefit. They have an organization called Sea State that is also analyzing that same data at the same time and moving the fleet around to avoid bycatch. So they're in real time monitoring themselves and moving. They don't want to get shut down. They don't want to catch too many herring or too many chum salmon. So they are also monitoring in real time and directing the boats. I think it's every week during the fishery. They're reanalyzing and moving boats around.
Any additional questions? If not, please thank once again Ebett for being our rock talker. For anyone online and for those of you that are here, this is only the second week This is only the second day of the classes that are currently on the island. Just be reminded that we do have a rock talk every Tuesday throughout the summer. This was our 7th. There will be 15 this summer. So even when you are not on the island, you're welcome to join us online at 8 o'clock on any Tuesday. Next week's rock talker will be our very own Tom Good, who will be speaking on the aquatic canaries in the canaries in the aquatic coal mine or something along those lines. And we'll be hearing something like that. So we look forward to our rock talk next week as well. For those of you in the room, Ebett will be here for the rest of the 2 week. Ebett will be in and out for the 2 week period. So please grab her at a meal should you be interested in learning more about the fisheries system and the ecosystem centered management that she's talking about. Thanks one more time, Ebett. That was a great rock talk.